Hi, everyone. My name is Tusif Noor. I am the Spiegel-Wilkes Curatorial Fellow here at the ICA Philadelphia, where we believe in the power of art to inform and inspire. Before we begin with today's program, I'd like to announce some upcoming programs. So this Saturday, December 7th, from 7 to 10, we're excited to partner with Blue Stoop and Paul Robeson House for our annual ICA Gather. This one's titled Here We Stand, and it'll be a night of readings and reflections that pay tribute to the resilience and cultural richness of West Philly's Black community. On Sunday, December 8th, from 2 to 5, we'll be celebrating Scribe Video Center's 2019 documentary history project for youth, and we'll be screening their short documentary films that the teens have made on the theme of youth activism. So please join us for those two events. I mentioned earlier that the ICA is a place where we engage with the art of our time. On the 30th annual Day Without Art, in partnership with Visual Aids, I'd like us to think even more critically about this mission. How much has art filled and fulfilled our lives? How many times we've been moved by something that we've seen or heard, something that we've shared with others? The art of our time. What could that have looked like when there were so many possibilities? 30 years ago, when Day Without Art began in 1989, it's estimated that 14,544 people died from AIDS-related complications. Today, I'd like us to think not only about our past, but about our present and about our future. It's my honor today to introduce Jean Carlomusto, a filmmaker and activist in the HIV/AIDS video movement, who was a founding member of Fierce Pussy and started the media unit at the Gay Men's Health Crisis in 1987, and was a founding member of DIVA TV, which was the video unit of ACT UP. Carlomusto was also a member of Testing the Limits Collective and has collaborated on a number of works. We'll be screening a selection of these works right now. The screening is about 40 minutes, after which Jean and I will be in conversation. And the films are Compulsive Practice, which was a project from 2016 for Visual Aids, Sex in an Epidemic, 2011, Larry Kramer in Love and Anger, 2015, which was nominated for an Emmy, and it premiered on HBO. Doctors, Liars, and Women, AIDS Activists Say No to Cosmo, from 1988, and Guts to Be a Drag. So thank you all so much. Sorry, and the first of the videos is called L is for the Way You Look, and I'm really excited for this in particular because I had the idea to bring Jean in conjunction with our exhibition that's up right now, Arms Ache Avid Eon, which features the work of Fierce Pussy members Zoe Leonard, Joy Apicella, Carrie Yamaoka, and Nancy Brooks Brody. So when we start the screening, you might see some familiar faces. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Jean. Can we get another round of applause? I thought that was fantastic. Wow. I think one of the reasons why I think the exhibition that we have on right now, Arms Ache Avid Eon, is so powerful is because I think it deals really nicely with the different kinds of power between the individual and the collective. And I think that is something that we just saw in this screening program, where you've highlighted both individual people, Larry Kramer, some of the people that are featured in here are major people in queer history, but then there's also the power of the collective. And I think I'd like to sort of start with, what is that power of the collective? Why were they so important? And you were part of a number of them, one of them being Fierce Pussy, the other being Testing the Limits, DIVA TV. I think maybe if we can start with how did collectives sort of become the mode of organizing during the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early stages of it. How did you get to be involved in them?
Well, first, just thank you for the invitation, and also just the Still Beginning program, for those of you who saw the first program, was quite wonderful, just a wonderful collection of work. And I see a connection between that work and what I've brought forward, and it has to do with issues of visibility and empowerment. And to answer your question about collective work, I mean, first of all, we were working in collectives because we had nothing. You know, that was one of the biggest motivations, is that it was the way for us to amplify the activism that was going on, and a way to make our voices that much louder. So it was expedient action, collectivity. It was very important. In the long run, it had its problems, because now, after all this time, the life of a tape, of an action, would exchange so many hands. We'd shoot the tape, and then Greg Bordowitz and I, who are working at Gay Men's Health Crisis, would use the material for our weekly cable show. Then we would bring it to DIVA TV, the collective in ACT UP, and put it into the pool and make another work that was more a product of ACT UP, amplifying ACT UP's actions. And then it would go to Testing the Limits Collective, where they would do a longer form documentary. And so the only problem with that is, like, 10 years later, who does it belong to? And so it's annoying to me sometimes, if I want to access a tape that I actually shot, and, it's unclear. Can I use it? So, but, that's minor. That's in retrospect. I have to say, though, that the most amazing thing about collectives was the sheer energy of being on the streets together, or being in the editing room together, and that energy of everyone being so gassed up, so basically engaged in just wanting to get this out. And it's amazing how many big personalities would manage to play nice.
Yeah, I mean, one of the other major things about collectives is what you just described, going from DIVA TV. One of the amazing things about DIVA TV is that the acronym is Damned Interfering Video Activists. And I think that really speaks to the mode of what was happening. You needed to interfere. You needed to make noise, right? Because what you just described, that system of taking that information, shooting that video, shooting these actions, getting that word out there, it was because no one else was doing it, right? So you have the government who doesn't give a fuck. You have like people on, as we've seen, we saw media people lying about what was happening. There's so much misinformation. How do you get, the correct information? How do you respond to what was actually happening to members of your community? And that is through that kind of media activism. So I think one of the next really important things that I wanted to discuss is media activism and what that meant, both during that time period and maybe kind of thinking about what that means now. So, as you said, you would take footage, you would have your public, live broadcast, and these are things that you were doing yourself. You didn't have like a huge budget. You didn't have any of that. So maybe if we could talk a little bit about what media activism really meant during that time, and how important it was to really take matters into your own hands and get that information out there, because there wasn't a system in place for doing so.
Well, one of the first things is we had to sort of claim validity to our practice, to our media practice. That was so vital. And for that reason, I wanted to begin this. I don't know if you remember, at the very beginning, there was a press pass. And that was something that we in DIVA did, this was in 1989, way before 9/11 enhanced security. But at that time, we basically modeled that press pass, that hot pink press pass, after what the city issued. Because our experience was, when we went to shoot actions, when the actual civil disobedience happened, when people started laying in the street, we would get hustled off to the sidewalk while the mainstream media would be allowed to continue shooting. So, what we did, our activism was making that press pass. And they were very effective. In the very beginning, they were effective. I think Ellen Spiro even opened up a bank account using, one of those as ID. So I think a big part of it was all of us basically saying, and this wasn't just in the media, this was also in the, in terms of treatment activism too, saying that we are the experts. We're the ones who are, in the streets with this. We're the ones who are trying to navigate our ways through this. Let's not leave this to the experts. That was a big part of it. And I would say one other thing, just in context, we have to look at the equipment. What was happening in the 1980s is that cameras got smaller. The equipment became much more affordable. What we were using in the 70s were these huge porta packs. Huge porta pack, it was weighed a ton, and umbilically tied black and white camera. And even that at the time, for that time, it was amazing, but it just really accelerated in the 80s and 90s. The equipment really got small, it got affordable, and then desktop editing came in. And that, again, that just really accelerated everything. And of course, if you want to bring it into current day practice, now it's a whole different game, in terms of course, social media.
And see, I think that's a great tie to the videos that we saw this year for Day Without Art's 30th anniversary, because with Shanti's work, for instance, highlighting that legacy of Keith. Keith founded Housing Works, and I think one of the things that's really important is, when ACT UP started, there were so many different arms of it. Like you said, DIVA TV, you have different kind of units, you have the research unit, you have the health unit. There were a lot of people capturing footage, but for you to actually go in, edit that footage, make that really accessible, that's a huge part. And it's because of people like you, and you in particular, honestly, that people like Shanti are able to go back and tell other stories of people who haven't been highlighted. And I think that's really important, because one of the things that again, going with the idea of the individual and the collective, we saw in your film about Larry Kramer, Larry mobilized so many people. There's so many people who see Larry Kramer as a face of the movement. But there were so many other people who were doing very, very similar things. So taking that idea of specificity within the larger movement is really important. And you see these strategies in the exhibition as well. I forgot to bring it up with me, but that poster right there that says Dyke, it has that is Jean's baby picture. And that's I think that's something so important, that people needed to recognize that the people who were, who carried the HIV virus, who had AIDS, were their mothers, sisters, daughters, friends, lovers, girlfriends, all of these things. If we saw in some of the media headlines that they said it was, gay cancer, these very nebulous, misinformed things. to take media into your own hands, to really personalize it, to make sure that people knew that, hey, this is happening right in our communities, that's a huge part of what media activism meant. Making that personal, telling these stories of a very personal, very, very effective ways of transmitting the idea that this is something that's really affecting communities. And I think that when I watch, I've been watching these Day Without Art videos for the past few years, you see that people are getting even more specific. They're talking about trans sex workers, they're talking about women of color, they're talking about Black women, they're talking about Black trans sex workers. It's taking all of these strategies. That was a big part of how AIDS activism started in the beginning.
Yeah, I agree with you on the point you were just making. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the piece with Sion is so touching for me, because here's someone who is deeply humiliated. She was outed by the father of her child on social media. And so what does she do? She comes back and she uses social media as a tool. She fights back using the very means that had tried to negate her. So that's very much a tactic that I think goes through all of this work, activist work, is sort of using, using the master's tools to disassemble the house. So that's important. I just want to say something to an earlier point you made. The reason I wanted to include the beginning of compulsive practice, where we go into my storage space, is because there are people like Ray Navarro, was an AIDS activist who is, far more articulate and far more engaged in the practice than, well, he was just an inspiration for all of us. There's so many people who are dead. So when people, if you want to say, I'm just fortunate that I survived. Greg Bordowitz says, it's a privilege growing old, and that's true. So, but I do feel a responsibility to tell these stories. And with Larry, one of the reasons I wanted to do it, you can't really see it in this segment. This is the beginning, so it's very laudatory of Larry. But I really wanted to do it because everybody hated him. He was a loudmouth. People kind of had this love-hate relationship with him. But as someone who started volunteering at GMHC in the mid-'80s, I just saw, what a pain in the ass he was and how important. It would have taken more years for people to really start, like, throwing blood and doing die-ins in the street, because at the time at GMHC, we were all very, very much involved in doing service provision. And that was important. I'm not saying that wasn't important, but we really needed to start getting vocal as well.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about the 2016 work about, compulsive practice a little bit, just because that, so just to go back, compulsive practice was for the 2016, so the 27th annual Day Without Art, and that was with Alex Uhas and Hugh Ryan. Can you talk a little bit about how that project came together? And we saw a little bit of a clip about it, but there were 9 artists that you covered in that?
Yeah. And it's in the same, well, that was the opening to it, but the hour-long project was very much like still beginning. It was just a compilation of different works that were commissioned, and that's another important mode, I feel, of contribution, is commissioning works. And that's why I wanted to show Gots to Be a Drag at the end, because that's not something, that wasn't my direction. This was it was a series of safer sex shorts that Greg Bordowitz and I commissioned. And the idea was to take music video, which was very, very hot at the time with MTV and everything, and try and infuse it with the safer sex message. And so we commissioned pieces from various communities. And in this one, it was This was the ballroom community. This was right before Paris is Burning came out. And one of the channels wasn't playing, but the person who hosted it, Tracy Africa, if anybody has been following the series Pose, Tracy is really the model for Angel's character. Tracy landed a major cosmetics endorsement. She was making it big until someone outed her as being trans, which was not even, this is kind of before that terminology was really in practice. So when Tracy is talking in this, she's using the language of that time. So like compulsive practice, I just think it's really important to commission these works and to help people realize their voice. Yeah.
And I think that's something that you and I were talking about earlier, about why the video format is so effective, right? So as you said, in the 80s and 90s, as that technology became more accessible, people could tell their own stories. We could commission people to talk about their own narratives, give a glimpse of their own lives, without speaking for them, without speaking over them. And you see that this has been going on for 30 years, and I think each and every year I learn a new perspective. I learn something. It gives so much dimension to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and I kind of want to, maybe if we could think about some of how these strategies you used as part of these collectives. For instance, one of the things that I was really sort of impressed with is when we see footage of these actions, you always see people being arrested and people being manhandled by cops, and it's important to get that documentation. We talk about now cops having cameras, body cams and everything like that, but someone had to be there back then to do that, to see how, you saw in the video people were taking down badge numbers. You had to write, you didn't have a cell phone to take a video to post on Instagram. You had to kind of have that documentation.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't, that was something I missed in telling you about DIVA. Our function was twofold. Part of it was to document actions, and the other part was to keep an eye on the police. Because again, this is before body cams and everything, so the way we would organize within ACT UP is each DIVA videographer would also be assigned to a different affinity group. So we all were also in charge. We weren't just shooting their protest or their civil disobedience, we were also documenting it in case. And there were occasions where our tapes were used in court when somebody got roughed up.
And maybe going with that, thinking about now today with social media, with all these different technologies that are available, what do you think? I mean, I have some thoughts, but what do you think we can learn? People who are doing activism today, people who are organizing today can learn from some of what, some of these tactics and some of sort of the guerrilla actions that Fierce Pussy was taking. I mean, it was really amazing to see kind of a poster that says, "I am a dyke," on the middle of the street. I still think that's pretty shocking. Despite all the media that we consume today, doing something that bold to fill that gap, to really highlight the struggle and the pain that was happening, the deaths that were happening in the community, that was a huge step. And I wonder what do you think that when you think about, because you also teach and you also, are engaging with a lot of younger activists and people who want to make video and media work. So what do you think that you have seen that people can really take away from some of these strategies?
Well, in terms of Fierce Pussy and those Xeroxes that are out in the gallery right there, they were all made to be wheat pasted on the street. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to show that section of Ella's For the Way You Look, because, you know, that's really when we were wheat pasting these works. That was their purpose. It wasn't gallery art. And this, you know, and this came out of, you know, the same kind of atmosphere that gave rise to, you know, David Wojnarowicz actually was there before. The same thing. He had work that was specifically meant to be Xerox. This was not gallery art. It was meant to be out in the street. And that was very powerful to have that work around you. In terms of, you know, what's going on today, I've seen so many great initiatives using social media, and some of them, one of them I was just mentioning. I would just say that I also feel, I think social media is extremely important, but I also feel getting out in the streets it's just really important. Just the visceral nature of people coming into contact with each other, and that kind of energy, you know, that synergy. There's just an incredible excitement, whether you're talking about, you know, I've seen photographs from activism in South Africa that I could see in their faces, folks on the street, you know, protesting, the same excitement, you know, the same like, oh my God, we're doing this, that I felt, you know, when I was out there with you know, my comrades doing this. And I don't know that social media gives that. I mean, it could do things we couldn't do. Just the immediacy, you know, there's so many things social media does really well, but I don't think it's the be-all and the end-all.
Absolutely. You know, I'll ask one more question, then we'll open it up. But again, one of the things that I really loved with opening with Ella's For the Way You Look is the focus on lesbians, on women. And there's something so, again, as you just mentioned, it is a social act, you know, to be with your friends, to talk about, you know, your crush on Dolly Parton and Fran Lebowitz. So much of what I have really taken away from the exhibition here is that being together is a huge part of any kind of politics, right? You know, I think people often talk about, you know, when the phrase came out, the personal being political. Yes, that's true, but it's actually, the political isn't just the personal. And actually the personal isn't just the personal on its own. The personal becomes political when there are stakes and when you share those stakes with other people, right? So seeing, you know, in the archive, you and I were walking through the show together and seeing, you know, you were saying, that's me, you know, holding the glue and, you know, doing the wheat pasting. You know, you were often behind the camera, but you were also there on the streets. There's something, I think, really important about highlighting the fact that there were specifically, Fierce Pussy was coming out of a desire, a need to highlight the fact that women were dying of AIDS. You know, as we saw in the clips, that people just didn't believe that. People were actually actively spreading misinformation. And for you to highlight that, I think is so important. To say that, you know, again, these are real women, these are real lesbians who are facing this disease. They've watched their friends die, but they're here together and they're at PS 122 watching Reno live, but also doing these actions. I think that's a huge part of that.
Yeah, one of the things that I think brought the women of ACT UP together originally is just having dyke dinners. That's such a big part of it. Is, you know, Emma Goldman famously said, you know, if I can't dance, I don't want the revolution. It's similarly, if we needed to get to know each other, to develop, to allow our culture basically to unfold. I mean, that's what helped fuel our activism. That's what helped make us trust each other, because when you're, you know, when you're going in the street and you're getting ready to get arrested, it's scary, because, you know, we were not getting up. You know, the police had to pick us up and carry us, and, you know, they could very easily drop us or throw our backs into the step of the bus or whatnot. So it was always a kind of thing where being together sort of mustered our courage to one another. It was really important. And what was the second thing that you were asking?
Just the specificity of lesbians, you know, and women.
It's great. Yeah, no, it was, the energy was really pretty amazing. And I just want to say, you know, it was just important for us to tap in, I should say, to that energy, because we have to be mindful of the fact that until 1993, the women's symptoms weren't a part of the overall picture of how you got an AIDS diagnosis. I mean, it was horrible what the CDC did in terms of women. And ACT UP, always people think of it in terms of treatment activism, and that was quite wonderful. But the other thing that we did was, you know, we changed the definition of AIDS so that women would be included. And that's not just, you know, everybody wants to belong. I mean, this was vital in terms of women getting the social services they needed. It was dependent on their getting an AIDS diagnosis. So this was, you know, this is really important work, and, you know, the fact that the women of ACT UP came together and were able to focus on this issue was important. And it kind of irks me that gets a little swept under the rug.
Let's take some questions from the audience, or comments, or anything.
I kind of wanted to ask a couple technical details about that moment in terms of the video production and the video collectives. I think there's maybe just two questions I was curious about. One is how much you were teaching each other. Like, was it about kind of spreading and recruiting new sort of practitioners and new activists? And maybe related to that or attached to that is also whether you all in New York were also passing footage and tapes to other chapters as other ACT UP chapters spread across the country and the world. Were you passing video material? Was there a lot of kind of interaction between, in particular, the video activists?
Yeah, so for the first part of your question, people came to DIVA with different levels of experience. I had gone to film school, so I was conversant with the technology of the time, but other people were coming in from very different backgrounds. They were coming in maybe from a more traditional art background. In fact, that's one of the reasons I didn't stay in Fierce Pussy after a while, because I loved the work we were doing, but I was a video maker, and Fierce Pussy was into prints, and so that's when I started focusing on work elsewhere. But we did teach each other, And it wasn't just one way. I would show people how to work the equipment, or how to, if they wanted to edit their piece, how to come to, they could come into GMHC. I'd show them how to use the editing station there. But, I was also learning from people in art school. I didn't go to art school. I went to film school. It's a little bit different. So, all of these, all the different art theory and everything, a lot of the people came out of the Whitney program in New York. So they were coming from a different head. And that was great, because we all kind of melded together. And overall amplified this product that was kind of a result of all of our sensibilities. In terms of sharing footage, we did, but not as much. And part of it, you see, nowadays, you could just, send somebody a link, or you could just Dropbox it to them. But then you had to physically give them the tape. So yes, we did share, especially when, for instance, when we went to Washington to do an action, or when we went to Atlanta to do an action, we would hook up with the local activists and we would share footage, because we could just give them the tape, they make a do, vice versa, and then we go. But less likely to put it in the mail. It just, these were dubs. You could mail dubs, but some of what was going on also depended on the immediacy. Things had to be passed quickly. Things were happening so quick.
Did you have a question back there?
Somebody else in the back?
I was just wondering, I see like a lot of footage of you guys interacting with the police, and then also you talking about resisting arrest, and if there was sort of like training that went into that resistance, and like how that was organized.
The training was vital, and there are people right now in New York. They were there doing it then, and they're actually in some of the videos. I'm thinking of Alexis Danzig and Jamie Bauer, and they are just master civil disobedience teachers. That's what they do all the time. They're teaching sessions all the time, and it's really important, because it's important to get the training. It's important to know or to understand there's certain agreement we have if we're doing civil disobedience together. Like, I don't want to do civil disobedience with somebody who's going to get out of control. We all have an agreement that we're going to have certain rules, and this is how we get the bravery to go and do it. So I really recommend, if you're going to do civil disobedience, to get training, and people do it. I guess you have to look up whatever group you're going to do civil disobedience with, and see who's doing their training. But it's vital. I wouldn't do it without it.
Hi. I really enjoyed and found it really interesting, the music video. I think it was by Greg Bordowitz, if I got that correctly. And I'm a musician, and I was wondering what the role of both music as a medium and also these kind of mixed media collaborations was in during the crisis.
I'm going to just ask you, because there's a white noise in here. And
can you
my
speak
hearing is
into
awful.
the?
Oh yeah, sorry. I was talking pretty quietly. I was just wondering what the role, as a musician, I was really interested in that kind of mixed media music video format, and what kind of role music and also different kind of mixed media collaborations would have played in the late 80s.
Well, for the Safer Sex shorts, the idea, this one's pretty tame, but the original idea for them was that they'd have 3 elements. They would be part music video, part Safer Sex PSA, and part porn. So the other ones we did were much more pornographic. And, I think they were effective for their purpose, which was we wanted to show them in bars and in bathhouses. And it was a way just to say, part of the culture of this space includes other possibilities. and we're just getting the message out there about safer sex. So, I directed One for Lesbians on my couch with Annie Sprinkle and Joy Brown to a Sinead O'Connor song. That was, it was 1990s, that's what we were listening to. And so it was, it was an effective blend, and it was up to the individual artist to give it the sensibility. How much porn, or how the porn, is it even porn? I'm just using it as a slang right now. But the sexually explicit part, how is that going to interact with the music, and at what point, and how are you going to get to the message? Or maybe the message was just the guy actually rolled the condom on, And that in itself was really valuable, because at the time, there were so many people just taking out bananas and rolling condoms on them just to show folks how to properly use one. So, just having somebody, roll on a condom was really important.
And I think, what you also just spoke to, showing it in bathhouses, showing it as part of porn, the CDC is not going to go to the cock and do a PSA. Someone had to do that. You guys had to do it. And I think that is, for me, the sort of key takeaway here is that media activism is to meet people where they most need it and do it the most effective way. And who is going to know better than that than the people in the community, right?
Yeah, just to say how dire it was, in 1987, shortly after I started working at GMHC, the guy who hired me, he was the head of publications. GMHC put out this really innovative series of comic books, safer sex comics, and they were little 8-page, they were really cheap to print up, and they were quite wonderful. We would just print up loads of them and put them at various bars, bathhouses, and they were just fun. And it wasn't long after that Senator Jesse Helms used these very same safer sex comics and totally clamped down on AIDS education. First of all, he lied. He said that, this is your tax dollars. These are being funded by your tax dollars, and that was not true. But second of all, the Helms Amendment said, forbade any federal monies going into anything that promotes homosexuality. So in the height of the epidemic, you have this ban on anything that really addresses homosexuality or safer sex for homosexuals in a positive way. And it was just so freaking insane. But you know what? It's almost not as bad as now.
And that's kind of where, I wanted to take this. The title of this year's, Day Without Art is Still Beginning. It's taken from Greg Bordowitz's work, The AIDS Crisis is Still Beginning. And I guess I just wanted to reflect with you on that. As you said, we're in a time where we're not, people are being discriminated against still, but the government is clamping down. They don't want people, they don't want queer people to thrive. They don't want, sex workers to thrive. They don't want HIV positive people to thrive. And we need to, again, take that into our own hands, right? And I think that's something that your work really speaks to me about. It's, you can't wait to, get some job where it's like, oh, great, now I'm a professional activist, someone has, you just have to do it. And I think that is something that these films this year also are emphasizing. She, Sian, she was being discriminated against, outed on social media as this person. She had to take matters into her own hands. That's something that I think social media does allow us to do. Despite all of its problems, there is a role that we can all play by being media aware, by getting media education, by being very kind of aware of the media that we consume, but also the media that we put out, and how we can use that for good. And I think maybe we can reflect on that and as a closing sort of way.
Okay, I think it's important to point out that the AIDS crisis is still beginning, but it's not just beginning, okay? And part of what's really important is, you know, let me just say before I get to this, is the reason I wanted to show that little clip of Sex in an Epidemic is I wanted to go back to 1981 before people knew what it was, and just talk about the dread fear. It was like a horror film, you know, a strange cancer that was knocking people off and people, you know, making them into human skeletons and these awful lesions and everything. It was truly scary. I think it's important to remember that, and it's important for those of us who saw it, or even those of us who are just coming to it, to continue to learn the history. Activism is fantastic, but it's so much more powerful if you understand the history and the context of what you're doing. And so part of what I see my role at this point is just hearkening back to some of the history, just to keep that relevant, because it keeps on repeating itself. The thing that happens, and the thing that's happened with almost every Republican president, is they start going back to abstinence education. Now, abstinence education has scientifically proven not to work. You know, what works is giving people the whole gamut, and, you know, and also it's age appropriate, of course. But, you know, this is what works. Yet, you know, the minute the evangelical influence comes in there, then what you have is just, you know, we don't want to talk about sex, just tell them not to have it. And it's so dangerous. You know, the pregnancy rates go up through the roof, STDs, and you know, it's horrible HIV prevention, and it's not an educational, it's a moral message, but it's not education.
Thank you all for coming today. Thank you, Jean.